What would you do if you saw an old man, shivering alone on a park bench, unable to remember who he was? Would you stop to help, even if you had nothing to give? Malik, a 12-year-old boy struggling to survive, made a choice that changed everything. But he never expected that one act of kindness would bring a stranger to his door in a luxury car and alter his life forever. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to hear more incredible stories. The wind was brutal that night. It howled through the narrow streets of Brooklyn, slipping through the cracks in old brick buildings, rattling loose window panes, and biting at the exposed skin of anyone caught outside. The streetlights cast long, thin shadows across the cracked sidewalks, their glow dim and flickering as if struggling to survive the cold themselves. 12-year-old Malik Carter hunched his shoulders against the icy wind, pulling his too thin hoodie tighter around his body. It didn't help much. The cold slipped through the worn-out fabric as if it wasn't even there, sinking into his bones, making his fingers ache and his nose sting. His breath puffed out in little clouds, disappearing into the night. His stomach growled, an all-too-familiar reminder that dinner had been, well, non-existent. He had learned to ignore hunger. Some days, his mom managed to bring home a little extra from the diner where she worked. Maybe a half-eaten sandwich a customer didn't touch or a small container of soup the chef let her take before closing. Other nights, it was just whatever they had, stale crackers, a few slices of bread, maybe some peanut butter if they were lucky. Tonight was not one of those lucky nights. Malik had spent the last hour digging through the streets, picking up soda cans, hoping to scrape together enough change for at least a bag of chips or a small piece of bread from the bodega. But aluminum wasn't worth much. He had only managed to collect a handful of crumpled, half-flattened cans, maybe 50 cents worth. Not enough. Not for him. Not for his mom. Not for Zuri, his little sister. The thought of her curled up in their apartment, waiting for something he didn't have, made his chest feel heavy. She was only 6, too young to understand why some kids had full plates and others went to bed hungry. His steps quickened. The faster he got home, the faster he could pretend he wasn't hungry, could tuck Zuri in, tell her a made-up story, and convince her that tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow always had to be better. But then, just as he turned the corner near Prospect Park, the laughter stopped him in his tracks. "Yo, Malik." His stomach twisted before he even turned his head. He already knew who it was. Under the bright glow of a cafe sign, a group of boys stood huddled together, their coats thick, their sneakers clean, steaming cups of hot chocolate in their hands. They looked warm, comfortable, well-fed, nothing like him. At the center of the group was Tristan Matthews, a kid who had everything Malik didn't. Blonde hair, always styled, expensive backpack, sneakers that probably cost more than Malik's mom made in a week. Tristan smirked, taking a sip from his cup before calling out again. "Find anything good today, trash boy." Laughter erupted around him. Malik felt his jaw clench. He knew better than to respond. Words wouldn't change anything, wouldn't make the hunger go away, wouldn't stop the cold from biting at his skin. Still, Tristan wasn't done. He never was. "Maybe if you smile, someone will throw you a few pennies." Another kid chuckled. "Or maybe not. Nobody tips street rats." The words stung, but Malik didn't stop walking. His mother had warned him about kids like them. "You don't get to make mistakes the way they do, Malik," she had said once, her voice low and firm. A black boy standing up for himself is always seen as trouble, no matter how right you are. So he swallowed his pride and kept walking, pretending their words didn't stick to him like frost on bare skin. He turned the next corner, putting distance between himself and their laughter, but he could still feel it clinging to him. It always did. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made him pause. A figure sat hunched over on a weathered bench, barely moving, A thin jacket clutched around his frail frame. For a moment, Malik thought the man was just another person trying to get out of the cold for a while, maybe resting before heading home. But something about him seemed off. He wasn't shuffling around, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He wasn't moving at all. Malik hesitated. This wasn't his problem. He had enough to worry about: an empty stomach, an overdue heating bill, a mom who worked herself into exhaustion, and a little sister who needed more than he could give. But the way the old man sat there, so still, so lost, something about it made Malik's chest tighten. He stepped closer, clearing his throat. Sir." No response. Malik tried again, softer this time. "Hey, are you okay?" Slowly, the man lifted his head. His eyes, a faded blue, met Malik's with a flicker of recognition, then clouded over again like fog rolling in. His lips parted, breath shaky. I don't know." His voice was barely above a whisper. Malik frowned. He glanced around the park. Empty. Nobody else seemed to notice the old man sitting there, shivering, lost in whatever place his mind had taken him. Now that Malik was closer, he could see it clearly. The man's clothes, though worn, were once expensive. His shoes were polished but scuffed, like he had been walking for hours. He didn't belong here. "Do you know where you're supposed to be?" Malik asked, shifting from one foot to the other. The man blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused. I was with someone, I think. But I can't." His voice cracked. His fingers twitched in his lap, gripping at nothing. Malik bit his lip. This was bad. He should call someone, except he didn't have a phone. And even if he did, who would he call? The cops. What if they didn't care? What if they just told him to move along? His stomach growled again, reminding him of the single slice of bread waiting for him at home. He was starving. His family was waiting. He didn't have time for this. But then, he looked at the man again. The way his hands curled into his thin jacket like he thought it could somehow keep him warm. The way his lips were turning pale. Malik knew what it felt like to be cold. He knew what it felt like to be hungry. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Be better than the world is to you." Malik sighed, pulling off his hoodie. He knew he'd regret it later, but he didn't care. "Here," he muttered, draping it over the man's shoulders. The old man looked up at him, startled. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite understanding, but something close to gratitude. Malik swallowed hard. "Come on," he said before he could change his mind. "It's too cold to be out here. You can stay with me tonight." The man stared at him, blinking slowly. "Home," Malik nodded, ignoring the voice in his head screaming this is a bad idea. "Just for the night," he clarified. "You need a place to stay, and he hesitated, then sighed. "I can't just leave you here." For a long moment, the old man didn't move. Then, slowly, his trembling fingers reached out, gripping Malik's sleeve like a child afraid of getting lost. Malik took a steadying breath. He was already in this now. No turning back. Adjusting his empty bag over his shoulder, he started walking. The walk home felt longer than usual. Maybe it was the weight of Malik's own exhaustion pressing down on him, or maybe it was the way the old man's unsteady footsteps shuffled against the cracked sidewalk beside him. Every now and then, Malik had to tighten his grip on the man's sleeve, steadying him when he wobbled. The wind howled through the empty Brooklyn streets, and with every gust, he felt the cold bite deeper into his skin. Giving up his hoodie had been a mistake. Malik was already shivering, but it was too late to take it back. He had made his choice. He always made these kinds of choices. The apartment complex loomed ahead, a towering reminder of everything Malik wished he could change. The building was old, the bricks stained with years of neglect. The front door stuck sometimes, and the elevator had been broken for as long as he could remember. The hallway smelled of damp carpet, cigarette smoke, and someone's burnt dinner from earlier in the evening. As they reached the steps, the old man hesitated. His cloudy blue eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for a second he looked even more lost than before. Malik swallowed hard. Was this a mistake? He pushed the thought away. It didn't matter now. The man needed help, and Malik had already decided to give it. Pushing open the apartment door, Malik stepped inside first, bracing himself. The small living space was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, its flickering glow casting long shadows on the walls. His mother, Lena, was hunched over the kitchen table, a stack of unpaid bills spread in front of her. Her dark curls were pulled into a loose bun, strands escaping to frame her tired face. The worry lines on her forehead seemed deeper tonight. Across the room, Zuri, his 6-year-old sister, was curled up on the couch, her tiny fingers flipping through the pages of a worn-out picture book. She looked up the second the door creaked open. "Malik," she chirped, a bright smile lighting up her face, until she noticed the figure standing behind him. Lena looked up too, and the moment her gaze landed on the frail, trembling old man, her expression darkened. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Malik," she said slowly, wariness lacing her voice. "Who is this?" Malik shifted uncomfortably. I found him at the park," he admitted. His voice was steady, but he could already feel the argument coming. "He was alone, freezing. He doesn't remember where he's supposed to be." Lena's eyes flickered to the old man again, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Malik," she exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. "We don't have," she stopped herself, glancing at Zuri, who was watching intently. Malik knew what she wanted to say. "We don't have enough money, enough food, enough space." But how could he just leave the man there? "I couldn't just walk away," Malik insisted. "It's just for tonight." Lena looked at him for a long moment, her jaw clenched tight. Then finally she let out a slow, tired sigh. "I don't have much," she said, softer now. Then she stepped aside. "Come in, sir. Warm yourself up." The old man shuffled inside hesitantly, his eyes darting around the cramped apartment as if trying to place where he was. Malik guided him to the rickety chair at the kitchen table, and the man sank into it with a quiet groan, his frail hand still clutching Malik's hoodie around himself. Then, suddenly, small footsteps. Zuri. She had hopped down from the couch, her tiny bare feet padding across the floor. Her wide brown eyes studied the old man carefully. "Is he sick?" she asked softly, glancing up at Malik. "I don't think so," Malik answered. "Just lost." Zuri nodded thoughtfully, then disappeared into the small bedroom she shared with Malik. A few moments later she re-emerged, her tiny arms clutching a thin, patched-up blanket. She walked up to the old man and carefully draped it over his lap the same way she tucked in her dolls at night. "There," she whispered. Malik saw it, the shift in the man's expression, the slight widening of his eyes. The way his lips parted like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Malik swallowed against the lump forming in his throat. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who hadn't expected kindness. Lena moved swiftly, pulling a pot from the stove. The faint smell of watered-down broth filled the air, thin but warm. She ladled some into a bowl, setting it in front of the old man along with a single piece of bread. She placed another bowl in front of Malik, but he barely touched it. Instead, he broke his piece of bread in half and slid the rest onto the old man's plate. Something twisted in his stomach, not hunger but something deeper. The old man lifted his spoon with a trembling hand, taking a slow sip. His breath hitched. For a long moment he just stared at the bowl like he had forgotten what it felt like to eat a warm meal. His fingers curled around the edge of the table, knuckles white. Then quietly he whispered, "Thank you." Lena's gaze softened. Malik chewed the inside of his cheek, his throat tight. They ate in silence after that. It wasn't much. Just thin soup, stale bread, and the flickering warmth of a too-dim light bulb. But for the first time in a long while it felt like enough. As the night stretched on, the apartment fell into a heavy kind of silence, the kind that felt almost sacred. The old man, who Malik still didn't know the name of, was curled up on the couch now, wrapped in Zuri's blanket. His breathing was steady, though his hands twitched slightly in his sleep, like his mind was still restless. Malik sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. He should have gone to bed, but something kept him awake. Maybe it was the way the old man had looked at them during dinner, like he couldn't believe he was being taken care of. Maybe it was the way his mother had silently pulled out an extra pillow without saying a word about how little they had. Or maybe it was the thought that somewhere someone had to be looking for him, someone had to care. Malik's gaze drifted to the old man's wrist, where a thin silver bracelet caught the weak light. It looked old, worn. The edges dulled from time, the metal slightly scratched, but there, etched faintly into the underside of the band, a series of numbers. A phone number. Malik's breath caught, his fingers brushed against the cool metal as his mind whirled. Could this be a clue? Could this be the key to getting the old man home? His heart pounded as he traced over the numbers, a new kind of determination settling in his chest. Tomorrow he would find out. The apartment was eerily quiet. Not the kind of quiet Malik was used to. The kind where exhaustion hung in the air after his mom worked a double shift, or the kind where Zuri had already fallen asleep, clutching one of her worn-out stuffed animals. No, this quiet was heavier, thicker, like it carried something unspoken. The old man, who still had no name, was curled up on the couch, his frail body wrapped in Zuri's thin blanket. His chest rose and fell with slow, uneven breaths, his hands twitching slightly even in sleep, like his mind was still somewhere else. Lost. Malik sat on the floor, his back resting against the couch, staring at the man. He had spent the last hour wondering if he had done the right thing, bringing him here, feeding him, giving up what little they had. But then he thought about how the man had clutched that bowl of soup, how he had whispered thank you like it was the first time in a long time anyone had been kind to him. Yeah, it was the right thing. But now what? Malik knew the man couldn't stay here forever. They barely had enough for themselves. And the way his mom had looked at him earlier, the exhaustion in her eyes, the silent weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders, he knew she was thinking the same thing. The man had to have someone. Somewhere, but who? That's when Malik noticed it. The dim kitchen light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the room, and in that dull glow something on the old man's wrist caught the light. Malik leaned in, eyes narrowing. A bracelet, thin, silver, a little worn like it had been there for years. At first it didn't seem like much, just another piece of jewelry, but when Malik looked closer he saw something faintly etched into the underside of the metal. Numbers. A phone number. His pulse quickened. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the bracelet before carefully turning the man's wrist to get a better look. The numbers were slightly faded, but they were still readable. A phone number meant something. A phone number meant someone. Was it his? Was it a relative's? A friend's? Was there actually someone out there looking for him? Malik felt his stomach twist. What if there wasn't? What if he dialed the number and the person on the other end didn't care? But he had to try. Taking a deep breath, Malik stood up and walked over to the kitchen phone, the old, battered landline that barely worked but was still their only connection to the outside world. He wiped his sweaty hands on his pants, then slowly, carefully, dialed the number. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Malik's heart pounded. Then, finally, someone answered. "Hello," a man's voice, sharp, urgent. Malik swallowed hard, suddenly unsure what to say. He glanced back at the old man on the couch, still fast asleep. Hi," Malik said, gripping the phone tighter. I think I found someone who belongs to you." Silence. Then the voice on the other end changed. It sharpened, the urgency turning into something more, something frantic. "Who is this?" the man demanded. "My name's Malik," he said, shifting on his feet. I found an old man in the park tonight. He was alone. He didn't know where he was or who he was. He had this bracelet and it had this number on it, so I thought. A sharp inhale, then a choked sound, like someone had just punched the air out of him. "Oh my God," the man whispered. Malik felt his stomach tighten. This was real. "Where is he?" The man's voice was shaky now. "Is he okay? Is he hurt?" Malik glanced back at the couch. The old man looked peaceful, his breathing steady. "He's safe," Malik assured him quickly. "I brought him home with me. He was freezing when I found him, so I gave him some food and let him rest." The other end of the line was silent for a long moment. Then the man exhaled shakily. "His name is James Holloway," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's my father, James." Malik let the name sink in. It felt strange to finally have one. James Holloway, not just some lost old man, not just someone the world had forgotten, someone's father. "My dad has early-stage dementia," the man, Adrian Holloway, continued, his voice strained. "He gets confused sometimes. I took him to the park today to get some fresh air, and I turned my back for 1 second to take a call. When I turned around, he was gone." Malik closed his eyes. He wasn't just some man who had wandered off. He was someone's family. "I've been looking for him for hours," Adrian said, voice breaking. "I thought," he cut himself off. Malik could hear it, the fear that had settled deep in his bones. The what if? What if he hadn't found him? What if no one had? Malik gripped the phone tighter. "I got him," he said. A long pause. Then Adrian spoke again, steadier this time. "Where are you?" Malik hesitated. He wasn't used to trusting strangers, especially not ones who sounded like they came from a world far removed from his own. But this man, he didn't sound like someone pretending to care. He sounded like someone who had just been given back something he thought he had lost forever. So Malik took a deep breath and told him where to find them. After hanging up, Malik stayed by the phone for a long moment, his mind spinning. Zuri had fallen asleep, curled up on the couch beside James, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. His mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Malik exhaled. "His son," he said, glancing back at James. "He's coming to get him." Lena was quiet for a long time, then she nodded. They didn't have to say anything else. The apartment was still again. But this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt like something had shifted, like something was about to change. The night had settled into a deep silence, wrapping Brooklyn in a thick, wintry stillness. Inside the tiny apartment, the air felt heavier than usual, not from tension, but from the weight of what was about to happen. Malik sat by the window, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns in the thin layer of condensation on the glass, watching, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, an engine rumbled. A set of headlights cut through the dimly lit street, their glow bouncing off the cracked pavement. Then finally, a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop in front of Malik's building. For a moment, Malik just stared. The car didn't belong here. Everything about it, the way its dark paint gleamed under the streetlights, the smooth purr of its engine, felt foreign in a neighborhood where cars were dented, scratched, or barely running. The door opened. And then Adrian Holloway stepped out. Malik had imagined a lot of things about the man on the other end of the phone. But the person who stepped out of the SUV wasn't what he expected. Adrian was tall, broad-shouldered, and sharply dressed. His dark wool coat draped over a crisp dress shirt, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he hurried toward the entrance. But beneath the elegance, Malik saw something else. The exhaustion, the worry, the desperation. Adrian's eyes darted around the apartment building, scanning the worn-down bricks, the rusted fire escapes, the dim light barely flickering above the entrance. He looked like a man completely out of place, but too frantic to care. Malik barely had time to move before a knock rattled the door. Lena, standing near the kitchen, gave him a look, one that said, "Are you sure about this?" Malik swallowed and nodded. Slowly, Lena opened the door. Adrian didn't hesitate. His sharp gaze swept across the room before it landed on the couch. on the frail figure curled beneath Zuri's patched-up blanket. His father. Adrian let out a shaky breath. His shoulders slumped and he stepped forward, his hands hovering just above his father's sleeping form like he was afraid to wake him. "Oh, thank God," he murmured, almost to himself. For a few long moments he just stood there, staring at the man he had thought he lost forever. Finally, Adrian turned to Lena, then to Malik. And for the first time he really looked at them. His gaze swept over Lena's tired eyes, Malik's too thin hoodie, the flickering light bulb that barely lit the room. He took in the worn-out furniture, the pile of overdue bills on the kitchen table, the single loaf of bread sitting on the counter, the only food in sight. Then his eyes softened. "You brought him in," Adrian said, his voice thick with something Malik couldn't quite place. "You saved him." Lena shook her head, crossing her arms. "We did what anyone would do." Adrian let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "Not everyone would." His fingers fumbled inside his coat pocket for a moment before he pulled out a thick white envelope. He extended it toward Lena, his expression earnest. "I know you didn't do this for a reward," he said, his voice gentle, "but please take this as a thank you." Malik watched as his mother's posture stiffened. Lena didn't even look at the envelope. She crossed her arms tighter, her face unreadable. "We don't take handouts," she said, her voice steady but not unkind. Adrian exhaled, nodding slowly as if he respected that answer, even if he didn't agree with it. But then his gaze flickered back to Malik. "Are you in school?" The question caught Malik off guard. He felt his stomach tighten. His eyes darted to his mother, but she looked away, her jaw clenching slightly. It was all the answer Adrian needed. "You want to be," Adrian said, more a statement than a question. Malik hesitated. His throat felt tight. "I mean, yeah," he admitted, his voice quieter than he wanted it to be. "But we don't exactly have." Adrian held up a hand, cutting him off. "You do now." Malik blinked. For a second he thought he had misheard. "I'll cover it," Adrian continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Tuition, supplies, whatever you need." Malik's hands curled into fists. This didn't make sense. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Adrian studied him for a long moment. Then finally he said, "Because the world needs more people like you." The words hit Malik harder than he expected, and then Adrian added, softer now, "And because I can." Malik glanced at his mom again. For the first time in a long while, she didn't look exhausted. She just looked torn. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, she nodded. And just like that, everything changed. 1 week later, Malik stood in front of a new school building, his backpack slung over his shoulders. The weight of it felt different than what he was used to. It wasn't just books inside. It was a future. A chance. He exhaled, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. His stomach was knotted with something that felt like nerves, but also, for the first time, hope. As he turned to glance back, he spotted a familiar black SUV parked at the curb. Adrian was inside, watching. He didn't wave, he didn't call out, he just gave a single small nod, like he was saying, "You've got this." Malik took a deep breath and stepped inside. A week had passed, but for Malik it felt like a lifetime. So much had changed in just a few days, things he never thought possible. And yet, here he was, standing in front of a brand new school, his brand new backpack slung over his shoulders. The morning air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the chatter of students filtering through the school's entrance. The building loomed before him, clean, bright, modern, nothing like the rundown school he used to go to. His fingers curled around the strap of his backpack as his stomach twisted, not from hunger this time but from something else, nervousness, excitement, hope. Malik thought back to the last few days, how fast everything had shifted, how different life already felt. It started with Adrian. After that night, after the promise he had made, Adrian didn't just disappear. He came back the very next day, and the next, and the next. He made sure Malik got enrolled in school immediately, covering every expense: uniforms, books, supplies, meals. Things that had always felt so far out of reach were now in Malik's hands, like they had always belonged there. He had spent the past week adjusting to the idea that his life was no longer just about surviving. Now, for the first time, he had a chance to live. It wasn't just Malik's life that was changing. His mother, Lena, had finally caught a break. After years of working double shifts at the diner, coming home too exhausted to even sit down, she had a better-paying job lined up. Adrian had helped. He had called in a favor, pulled some strings, and suddenly, she had an interview for a receptionist position at an office, one with benefits, steady hours, and enough pay that she wouldn't have to work herself into the ground. At first, Lena had resisted. She didn't like accepting help, didn't like the idea of someone swooping in and fixing things for them. But Adrian never made her feel like a charity case. "You don't owe me anything," he had told her. "This is just an opportunity. You've been doing all the hard work already, you just need someone to see it." And for once, someone did. She got the job. And just like that, for the first time in years, Malik saw his mother breathe. Not just a sigh of exhaustion, but a real, deep breath. A breath that said, "We might actually be okay." Then there was Yuri, his little sister who had spent so much of her young life worrying about things she shouldn't have to. Malik would never forget the way she used to ask in that small, uncertain voice, "Malik, are we gonna have food tomorrow?" Now she didn't have to ask, because for the first time she already knew the answer. They had food, they had warmth, they had hope. Malik's grip on his backpack tightened as he stared up at the school building. His new school. It still didn't feel real. A week ago, he had been collecting cans on the street, hoping to scrape together $1 for a slice of bread. Now, he was standing in front of a place where kids didn't have to wonder where their next meal was coming from. Where education wasn't just an afterthought, it was expected. Could he really belong here? Would he fit in? Would they look at him the same way Tristan had, the same way so many people had? He took a deep breath, trying to push the doubt away. Then he glanced back, and there it was. Adrian's black SUV idling by the curb. He wasn't leaving, not yet. Malik could see him through the windshield sitting there watching. He didn't wave, didn't call out, he just nodded. A single small nod, it said everything. "You've got this." And in that moment, Malik believed it. For the first time in his life, he truly believed in a better tomorrow, and it all began with a single act of kindness. Malik turned back toward the school, took a deep breath, and stepped inside.